That's all there is about it." "That's so?" the detective observed, with quiet sarcasm. "You seem to have a knack of making friends pretty easily, Miss Wenderley." "It's not your business if I have," she snapped. "Well, well, past that then," he conceded. "I haven't quite finished with you yet, though. There are just one or two more points I am going to put before you and this gentleman, who is not Mr. Douglas Romilly," he added with a little bow to Philip. "The first is this. There is one fact which we can all three take for granted, because I know it. I can prove it 100 times over, and you both know it, and that is that the Mr. Merton Ware of to day travelled from Liverpool on the Elletania as Mr. Douglas Romilly, occupied a room at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel as Mr. Douglas Romilly, and absconded from there, leaving his luggage and his identity behind him, to blossom out in the attic of the Monmouth tenement house as Mr. Merton Ware, a young writer of plays. Now I don't think," Mr. Dane went on, leaning a little further over the table, "that the Mr. Douglas Romilly who has disappeared was ever capable of writing a play. I don't think he was a man of talent at all. I don't think he could have written, for instance, The House of Shams. Let us, however, leave the subject of Douglas Romilly for a moment. Let us go a little further back, to Detton Magna, let us say. Curiously enough, there was another young man who disappeared from that little Derbyshire village about the same time, who has never been heard of since. His name, too, was Romilly. I gathered during the course of my recent inquiries that he was a poor relation, a cousin of Mr. Douglas Romilly." "He was drowned in the canal," Beatrice faltered. "His body has been found." "A body has been found," Mr. Dane corrected, "but it was in an unrecognisable state. It has been presumed to be the body of Philip Romilly, the poor relation, a starving young art teacher in London with literary aspirations. But I hold that the presumption is a mistake. I believe," the detective went on, his eyes fastened upon Philip, his voice a little raised, "that it was the body of Douglas Romilly, the shoe manufacturer, which was fished out from the canal, and that you, sir, are Mr. Philip Romilly, late art school teacher of Kensington, who murdered Douglas Romilly on the banks of the canal, stole his money and pocketbook, assumed his identity in Liverpool and on the Elletania, and became what you are now, Mr. Merton Ware." Philip threw away the cigarette which he had been smoking, and leaning over the box carefully selected another. He tapped it against the table and lit it. "Mr. Dane," he said coolly, "I shall always be grateful to you for your visit this morning, for you have given me what is the most difficult thing in the whole world to stumble up against, an excellent idea for a new play. Apart from that, you seem, for so intelligent a man, to have wasted a good deal of your time and to have come what we should call in English a cropper. I will take you into my confidence so far as to admit that I am not particularly anxious to disclose my private history, but if ever the necessity should arise, I shall do so without hesitation. Until that time comes, you must forgive me if I choose to preserve a certain reticence as to my antecedents." Mr. Dane, in the moment's breathless silence which followed, acknowledged to himself the perpetration of a rare mistake. He had selected Philip to bear the brunt of his attack, believing him to be possessed of the weaker nerve. Beatrice, who at the end of his last speech had sunk into a chair, white and terrified, an easy victim, had rallied now, inspired by Philip's composure. "You deny, then, that you are Mr. Philip Romilly?" the detective asked. "I never heard of the fellow in my life," Philip replied pleasantly. "But don't go, Mr. Dane. You can't imagine how interesting this is to me. You have sent me a most charming acquaintance," he added, bowing to Beatrice, "and you have provided me with what I can assure you is almost pathetically scarce in these days, a new and very dramatic idea. Take a seat, won't you? and chat with us a little longer. Tell us how you came to think of all this. I have always held that the working of a criminologist's brain must be one of the most interesting studies in life." Mr. Dane smiled enigmatically. "Ah," he protested, "you mustn't ask me to disclose all my secrets." "You wouldn't care to tell us a little about your future intentions?" Philip enquired. Mr. Dane shook his head. "It is very kind of you, Mr. Merton Ware," he confessed, "to let me down so gently. We all make mistakes, of course. As to my future intentions, well, I'm not quite sure about them. You see, this isn't really my job at all. It isn't up to me to hunt out English criminals so long as they behave themselves in this city. If an extradition order or anything of that sort came my way, it would of course be different." "Why not lay this interesting theory of yours before the authorities at Scotland Yard?" Philip suggested. "I'm sure they would listen with immense interest to any report from you." "That's some idea, certainly," the detective admitted, taking up his hat from the table. "For the present I'll wish you both good morning. Or shall I say au revoir?" "We may look for the pleasure of another visit from you, then?" Philip inquired politely. The detective faced them from the doorway. "Sir," he said to Philip, "I admire your nerve, and I admire the nerve of your old sweetheart, Miss Wenderley. I am afraid I cannot promise you, however, that this will be my last visit." The door closed behind him. They heard the shrill summons of the bell, the arrival of the lift, the clanging of the iron gate, and its subsequent descent. Then Beatrice turned her head. Philip was still smoking serenely, standing with his back to the mantelpiece, his hands in his pockets. She rose and threw her arms around him. "Philip," she cried, "why, you are wonderful! You are marvellous! You make me ashamed! It was only for a moment that I lost my nerve, and you saved us. Oh, what idiots we were! Of course he meant to watch. That's why he told me he was going to Chicago. The beast!" "He seems to have got hold of the idea all right, doesn't he?" Philip muttered. "Pooh!" she exclaimed encouragingly. "I know a little about the law. So do you. He hasn't any proof. He never can have any proof. No one will ever be able to swear that the body which they picked out of the canal was the body of Douglas Romilly. There wasn't a soul who saw you do it. I'm the only person in the world who could supply the motive, and I shall never be any use to them. Don't you see, Philip? I shall be your wife. A wife can't give evidence against her husband. You'll be safe, dear, quite safe." He withdrew a little from her embrace. "Beatrice," he reminded her, "there is another tragedy beyond the one with which Dane threatens us. I do not wish to marry you." She suddenly blazed up. "Because—" "Not because of any reason in the world," he interrupted, "except that I love Elizabeth Dalstan." "Does she want to marry you?" He was suddenly an altered person. Some of his confidence seemed to desert him. He shook his head doubtfully. "I'm not sure. Sometimes I think she would. Sometimes I fancy that is only a great kindness of heart and immense sympathy, a kind of protective sympathy, which has made her so good to me." She looked at herself steadily for a moment in the mirror. Then she pulled down her veil. "Philip," she said, "we find out the truth when we are up against things like this. I used to think I could live alone. I can't. Whatever you may think of me, I was fond of Douglas. It wasn't only for the sake of the money and the comfort. He was kind, and in his way he understood. And then, you know, misery didn't agree with you. You were often, even in those few hours we spent together, very hard and cold. Anyway," she added, with a little tightening of her lips, "I'm going to get my money now. No one can stop that. You stay here and think it over. It would be better to marry me, Philip, and be safe, than to have the fear of that man Dane always before you. And wait till you see me when I come back," she went on, her spirits rapidly rising as she moved towards the door.